On January 31st, the FCC announced a complete overhaul of its Lifeline program in order to help low-income Americans afford telecommunication services. In the past, the program has been geared toward telephone services, but now the Commission also hopes to help this same group receive high-speed internet access. And while most agree that the reform of the program is greatly needed, there are concerns with the FCC's execution of it. These concerns were intensified after new details from an audit reveal hundreds of thousands of cases involving fraud and abuse of the program, which results in a cost that falls on taxpayers. So at this time, we're going to bring in Larry Downs, a Senior Adjunct Fellow at TechFreedom, by way of phone to help us better understand this news. Thanks so much for joining us, Larry.
My pleasure.
Well, to begin, can you just give us a brief history of the Lifeline program and what it has done?
Sure. I mean, the Lifeline program has been around for a long time. It's part of a larger program known as Universal Service, and the idea is to make sure that regardless of whether someone is low income or whether they live in a very rural area, that they will have basic access to telephone service. The Lifeline service in particular is there in case of emergency. The idea was that anybody who needed dial tone would be able to pick up a phone, and if nothing else, be able to get emergency help and offer subsidy for people who otherwise couldn't afford even basic telephone service.
And where does the funding for this program come from?
Well, you can call it a tax, but it's not technically a tax. It's a fee that's levied against phone providers, including cell phone providers and landline providers. Throughout the history of the Lifeline program, that fee has been passed along to consumers. And if you look on your phone bill, you'll see something that says, universal service fee. It's usually a couple dollars for a cell phone plan every month. That's essentially a tax that consumers are paying to subsidize this program and other universal service programs for the FCC.
Right. Well, you've said that the FCC's Lifeline program was in dire need of an update, but what problems has it had in the past?
Well, I think there's general consensus from everyone, including all the commissioners at the FCC, that the Lifeline program has gotten very much out of control and very much sort of veered away from its intended goal. One of the problems with the program is there's no cap on the amount that will be needed. So if every single person who's actually eligible to get Lifeline subsidies applied for it, and there wasn't enough money in the fund, what the FCC does, and indeed has done several times, particularly in recent years, is simply to increase the size of that tax. So the more people who apply, the more money that everybody else winds up paying on their phone bill every month to subsidize the plan. That might not have been a bad thing if, in fact, the people who were getting service through Lifeline were, in fact, those who actually needed it. But there was utterly no controls, no audits, no databases, no real checks on eligibility. And so what was happening was that some people were getting multiple Lifeline subsidies, one for their landline phone, one for their wireless phone. Others were actually applying through lots of different carriers to get lots of different subsidies for wireless phones, even though technically they're only eligible for one.
Wow. Well, as unfortunate as it is, fraud is expected at some level with any program, but can you explain really to what degree this program has been abused, and specifically in terms of financials? Yeah.
Well, I'll give you the numbers that the FCC themselves have suggested. They think that once they've put in sort of some basic controls on this system, making sure whoever's eligible is only people who are applying, and that you only get one of these subsidies at a time, they think over the next 2 years, just those sort of basic controls will save them $3 billion.
Wow. Well, there are reports circulating that Senator Claire McCaskill received an offer that she was eligible for the Lifeline program, which is just further proof that there are serious issues.
One of the problems is that because the subsidy is, relatively generous, about $10 per eligible person, there's sort of been a whole industry that's built up, particularly in wireless, once they said it was allowed to be used to have a cell phone, a whole industry of companies that essentially what they do is they go out and sign up. They don't do anything else. They're kind of virtual carriers. They don't have their own equipment. They use roaming arrangements, and all they do is sign up Lifeline customers who are eligible, or who they say are eligible for the subsidy. So, they get the $10 subsidy, they make a small profit on it. If you sign up enough people, that's a working business model. Of course, the problem is some of the more unscrupulous providers of the service were just signing up, people multiple times, or signing them up in multiple different programs, and clearly violating the rules and indeed violating the law.
So should the FCC be to blame for this lack of oversight?
In part, yes. The corporation, there's a sort of a governmental corporation that has run the Universal Service Fund for quite some time. It has never been particularly professional in the way it goes about its administration of this and other funds, including there's a Internet fund for libraries called the E-Rate Fund, as well as the other Universal Service programs. As those programs have gone from modest sizes to being multi-billion-dollar programs, it's pretty much, I think, inexcusable that the FCC just failed completely to introduce the kinds of basic oversight, the kind of basic management techniques to make sure that this kind of waste and fraud wasn't escalating as it clearly was.
Well, as I said earlier, the FCC added a new element to the program that it hopes will bring broadband internet access to more Americans. So what concerns do you have with this aspect going forward?
Well, I think there's sort of the small one and the big one. The small one is a legal one and a procedural one. What the FCC is saying here is that they're going to, with this $3 billion that they're going to save by eliminating all the waste and fraud, they're going to take some of that savings and use it to make a sort of a pilot program of having the equivalent of a sort of lifeline for broadband, sort of basic internet service for people in low-income situations. The problem is, from a legal standpoint, they are relying on a section of the communications law that they continue to try to rely on as a way of expanding their authority, even when Congress hasn't acted to give them that authority. And so Commissioner McDowell, in particular, dissented from that part of the order, saying, you know, we might have authority elsewhere, but I don't understand why we keep relying on what's called Section 706 as a way of expanding our authority. Congress has not given us that authority, and the courts have repeatedly said, you know, that provision of the law is not a blank check for the FCC to introduce new programs. The substantive problem here is a bigger one, which is they're going to start spending the money now. They're going to introduce these pilot programs before they've actually implemented these databases and these other kinds of checks on the waste and abuse. So if it turns out that they don't actually save $3 billion over the next 2 years, they're going to have spent some of that money anyway on this pilot program. And I thought it made much more sense to, you know, introduce the reforms first, check again, let's say, in 6 months, and see if, in fact, the kinds of savings that they're realizing from those reforms line up with their estimates, and then they'll know if, in fact, there is any money left over to start investing in this new program.
Right. So what does happen now? I mean, can this be reversed?
Well, it's possible. Of course, the way things work in regulatory agencies is when an agency issues an order, which has now happened. In fact, they issued the order earlier this week. There's provisions that allow, in administrative law, for parties who are adversely affected, if they think the agency is acting illegally, they can sue, bring a lawsuit, and this goes directly to a federal court of appeals, who will then review the order and see if the court believes that in some or large or all ways exceeds the authority of the agency, and if so, then yes, it can be reversed. Nobody has yet come forward that I'm aware of to say they're going to challenge this particular order in its particular form, but again, the actual details were only, it is a 300-page report, so it's only come out in the last couple of days, and I'm not surprised that no one has had a chance yet to digest it well enough to decide whether they're going to challenge it.
All right, well, time will tell. Larry, thank you so much for your perspective on this.
Not at all.
With this WebPro News Report, I'm Abby Johnson.